Hello, and thanks for joining us for this event, which is the first of two events in which we'll review how COVID-19 has affected education systems around the world. I'm Professor John O'Regan, Vice Dean International at the UCL Institute of Education in London, and I'm very pleased to be your chair today. We're holding these events in conjunction with the International Network of Educational Institutes, which brings together 11 faculties of education, including the IOE, to support a worldwide conversation about issues in education. Although meeting online makes sharing experiences across continents much easier, we still face the barrier of different time zones. So our speakers today all hail from INEI member institutions located to the east of the UK. Tomorrow, we'll hear from INEI members located to our west, and I hope many of you will be able to join us for that event too. In terms of how today's event will run, once I've introduced our panelists, we'll hear briefly from each of them about their country's experience. But we want the discussion to be as interactive as possible, so please use the Q&A feature on Zoom to share your thoughts on what you're hearing and to post questions for me to ask the speakers. Within England, the immediate impact of the pandemic on our education system has been dramatic, to say the least. To pick out just two elements, our use of remote and online learning has accelerated rapidly, while we've had to determine university admissions without the school leaving exams that we've relied on so heavily for so long. On both counts, we've floundered. In the process, the impact of inequality on children's learning and well-being has been exposed even more starkly. In addition, the government's management of the developing COVID-19 crisis in our schools has been shown to have many shortcomings. However, whether these experiences will fundamentally change anything in education reform and with COVID management over the shorter and longer term remains an open question. As a faculty of education, we're home to a mix of optimists and pessimists, but all of us continue to share our research evidence in the hope that it will inform public debate and policy on the present and future of education, even if it is diluted by different political priorities. Well, that's England's experience, reflected to some degree across the other nations of the UK. To provide us with a broader perspective on COVID-19 and education, our speakers today are Dr. Kevin Kester from Seoul National University. Kevin is Assistant Professor of Comparative International Education and Peace Development Studies. An educational sociologist, he is also an active member of the Comparative and International Education Society, which draws its 3,000 members from over 110 countries. Our second speaker is Dr. Dennis Kwek from the National Institute of Education, Nanyang Technological University in Singapore. Dennis has over 25 years research experience in the UK and Singapore. He's currently Associate Dean at INEI and directs its Centre for Research in Pedagogy and Practice. Since 2004, he's led a multi-million-dollar government-funded suite of empirical studies into Singaporean classroom pedagogies. Our next speaker will be Professor Yasushi Maruyama from Hiroshima University. Professor Maruyama is Professor of Philosophy of Education and Deputy Executive Director for International Planning. His research interests include the philosophy of Wittgenstein, professional ethics in education, and post-colonialism. Following Professor Maruyama is Professor Zhang Xiaodong from Beijing Normal University. Professor Zhang is a professor in the Faculty of Education and Executive Director of the UNESCO International Research and Training Center for Rural Education. Her other research interests include early childhood education, teacher pay, and comparative education. And finally, our last speaker will be Dr. Natasha Zabel from the University of Melbourne. Natasha coordinates Melbourne's Master of Teaching primary program. Her research focuses on curriculum reform, and most recently, she's been examining the impact of COVID-19 on teaching and learning in Australian schools. Among her many other roles, Natasha is chair of the Parliament of Victoria's Education Advisory Panel. So that's all our speakers, and it's a great pleasure for me to welcome them all here. It's now my turn to introduce our first speaker, which is Dr. Kevin Kester. Kevin.
Thank you, Professor O'Regan. So I think it's important to first begin by noting some of the educational policies in Korea and the issues that they've been addressing before COVID hit. So the first issue here is the demographic decline, or the low birth rate domestically. This has led to government policies such as education subsidies to encourage families to have more children. And in higher education specifically, it has led to policies of further internationalization. The second issue is around multiculturalism and social justice. Here, there are two forces that are dominant. On the one hand, the increasing educational attempts to integrate multicultural students into schools, and on the other hand, efforts to ensure equal access to quality education for all, regardless especially of socioeconomic background. The third issue especially is key to the response for COVID-19, and that's around Industry 4.0 and an untact society. Now, untact is an amalgam of the prefix un and the second part of the word contact. The World Economic Forum's announcement of Industry 4.0 sent shockwaves through Korea policymaking circles in 2016 as they attempted to prepare for increased automation. This has meant preparing students more for an untact world of less human interaction and more digitization. Now that lays the foundation, but then enter COVID-19. COVID-19 has accelerated the responses in each of these areas. Concerning the demographic shift, COVID has revealed the possibilities for online learning. In a matter of just a few weeks when the virus first struck Korea in late February, just a few weeks before the annual start of classes in Korea, Korea transitioned more or less successfully to a virtual learning format. In just a few weeks, I think it would have been nearly impossible to conceive of this before the virus. Of course, this was possible because of the move to encourage K-MOOCs, or Korean Massive Open Online Courses, and virtual learning in the years before. The structure of the system, in other words, was already in place. What this reveals for the possibilities to respond to the demographic decline is that it may be more possible than previously expected to offer both in-person and online courses, as well as hybrid, to more students, both domestically and overseas, to fill the seats that are left void by the low birth rate. And I would propose one more possibility is emerging here: a collaboration between large corporations and education to make this happen at scale. Imagine if Samsung teamed up with the university in Korea to co-offer these courses and the tech platforms that facilitate them. This could en masse resolve aspects of the demographic decline. Two other issues made it feasible to go online so quickly: a standardized national curriculum that could be uniformly digitized, and a volunteer committee of teachers from various provinces helping to coordinate with central offices and to train local teachers in online teaching platforms. They call themselves the Community of 10,000 Teachers. Concerning multiculturalism and social justice, one of the earlier efforts by the government, once the essential IT and servers were in place, was to provide free tech to those families in need. The government first expanded servers through the Korea Education Research and Information Service, or KERIS, and Education Broadcasting System, EBS, to host online learning materials suddenly. Again, much of this hardware was already in place, but the capacity had to be quickly enlarged in order to support what they expected to be 3 million simultaneous users. Then, education tech such as laptops were distributed through schools and public-private partnerships to those families in need. In universities, funds were redistributed, such as international conference funding that was suddenly obsolete. It was redistributed toward updating internal technology, and providing living subsidies for many students. Additionally, many educators and international organizations in Korea are continuing to address what they call the multiple pandemics. That is the convergence of social, economic, environmental, healthcare, and educational inequalities. For example, it is understood that poverty doesn't just keep students from accessing educational content, but it also makes such students and their families more susceptible to the virus and toward getting more ill when those families lack access to quality healthcare and live in areas where social distancing is more difficult or where parents cannot afford to not expose themselves at work. Schools here provide daycare services for dual working families. Now, concerning untacked in schools and universities, this was supported with strong social distancing measures, such as the government's 5-tier system of social distancing and syncopated scheduling with students alternating days at school. Additionally, the long-standing tradition in many Asian countries of having teachers change classrooms in schools rather than students helped to minimize student-to-student contact, as did the installation of plexiglass barriers on desks and in cafeterias. So in short, COVID has radically facilitated a new normal of untacked and online learning, as well as a renewed inquiry into issues of justice across Korean education that would continue to impact in the years ahead. Now, there are 2 remaining key challenges to address. 1, how to increase student satisfaction, and 2, how to incentivize educators to embrace the new hybrid modalities. And with that, I'll stop. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Kevin. That's great. Okay, so to our next speaker then, which is Dr. Dennis Quek from the NIE. Dennis.
Thanks, John. I want to thank UCL-IOE and INEI for inviting me to be part of this interesting panel. And it's quite encouraging to hear what's happening in Korea. There's a lot of similarities with Singapore as well. So let me just quickly introduce Singapore for those who don't know. A small island state, about half the size of London, 5.7 million people, 1 political party since independence, and hence a stable government for more than 50 years. Now, in terms of the impact of COVID in Singapore, there's what started this year, especially in January onwards, there was a multi-ministry task force that was set up to conduct a whole of government set of strategies to tackle the outbreak. It's quite important for us to note how fast this was set up, with key ministers all involved in directing policy responses as fast and coherently as possible. A number of policies were set in place as well. I think similar to quite a number of countries, a national lockdown, which we call a circuit breaker for 2 months, the implementation of a national technological system of contact tracing, and strict regulations and enforcement of social distancing measures, which basically helped in many ways to cut down the number of cases that we have. So as of 12th of December, we have about 58,000 cases, 29 deaths, and currently no locally transmitted cases. Now, what's the impact of the pandemic on our education system? Let me talk a little bit more about that. During the circuit breaker period, schools were closed for 2 months. So students were effectively stuck at home for those 2 months, much to the horror of a lot of parents. The Ministry of Education rapidly implemented what was known as home-based learning for all the students, including aspects of online learning. And post-circuit breaker, of course, schools reopened, but with contact tracing, rotating timetables, social distancing in place. Now, let me go to the bigger picture and talk about some of the effects of the pandemic on our education system. First, the economy. As Singapore's economy is likely to go into the worst recession we have ever encountered since 1965, when Singapore became independent. Unemployment is going to be a serious problem. Second, overnight, the pandemic has brought a complete upheaval to the traditional classroom mode. Home-based learning has now become the norm, and the ministry urgently needed education and learning to continue, with tuition centers shut down. Some parents are hard-pressed to become home-based teachers. Students had to deal with technological issues and finding a conducive learning environment at home. Now, this led to a significant issue. Inequality became quite visible, as everyone could literally see right into their homes and what they look like. The digital divide has become quite explicit. For low-income families, 1 in 2 are not plugged in. There was an urgent need for technical, financial, social support for students, and especially disadvantaged children as well. Along with the digital divide came another serious problem as well, the mental well-being of students who had to stay at home and can't go out for close to 2 months. Youth psychiatric admissions went up by 2.5 times. For children with little parental support at home, a long tail on mental health is beginning to form. Teachers' roles have exploded as well. Not only must they be teachers, they must be health promoters, they must be ICT champions, and they must be social workers as well. The pastoral role of schools and teachers are greatly amplified. What can be done for these problems that popped up overnight? The pandemic was effectively, to many people, a black swan event, cannot be predicted, has severe consequences. I'm going to introduce very quickly an idea of what's known as policy capacity. Is the ability of governments to make policy choices, hopefully intelligent ones, scan the environment, execute plans, and assess policy alternatives. There are 4 common forms of policy capacities: operational capacity to provide resources for policy actions, fiscal capacity, financial ability to fund for such actions, political capacity is the ability to mobilize political support, and analytical capacity to ability to evaluate, analyze, and ensure policy actions are sound and contribute to policy goals. And we can see how such capacities are operationalized for education. The ministry was very quick to mobilize ICT and financial resources for students who lack internet connectivity at home. This is with regards to operational and fiscal capacities. The most ambitious push is to equip all secondary school students, about 146,000 of them, to be equipped with personal laptops or tablets by the end of next year, 7 years ahead of the original plan. There is a risk of a lost generation of youths and adults who are scarred by economic, psychological, and social impact. Reskilling workers is going to become a national priority. CET programs, skills upgrading initiatives, the role of universities to create multiple pathways to acquire new expertise. There are new possibilities for us as well, I think, especially for Singapore. There's an opportunity to re-examine the purpose of education for us, to move beyond a fairly utilitarian objective towards a more holistic emphasis on learning. The focus on pastoral care has redirected attention away from high-stakes examination towards parents recognizing that children's well-being and social emotional support must be attended to both in schools and at home. Home-based learning has brought up discussions around children's self-directed learning. Policymakers saw how this can be positive, and there is a need for us to be part of that conversation about understanding the role of self-directed learning at home. And finally, the issues around the digital divide, issues of inequality, they have to be tackled head-on, and those are opportunities for us to think about. This leads me to the issue of analytical capacity. While governments can operationalize operational, fiscal, political capacities, universities play a very key role in working with policymakers to enhance their analytical capacities. Our School of Education has a wealth of knowledge and deep understanding about research evidence base that can be brought to bear on a government's analytical capacity. The problem is that of timing. Policies tend to be rolled out quickly. Policymakers tend to want answers and results quickly, but researchers take time to come up with solutions. The late Jeff Wheaty has talked about this as the disjuncture between policy-facing research and practical realities of policy making in practice. But policy implementations have to be studied, often rigorously evaluated, so that we can understand what kinds of future tweaks are required. And perhaps a leaf can be taken from how it all began in Singapore with the formation of that kind of a multi-ministry task force. It suggests that analytical capacity has to be coupled with a fairly ecological, whole of society approach, what I think Kevin has suggested as well. The involvement of communities, of NGOs, and not just the work of universities alone has to play a key role in this. And I think that role of boundary workers, of the use of people working together, what Chris Chapman calls reticulous, who can span the research, policy, and practice nexus in order to generate fast policies, is going to be what's going to become an important feature of our educational research landscape in the future as well. With that, thank you very much.
That was really interesting. Okay, our next speaker is Professor Yasushi Maruyama from Hiroshima University. Professor Maruyama.
Well, thank you very much for introducing myself. My name is Yasushi Maruyama. Hiroshima University. I'm very honored to have this opportunity of talking about our situation in Japan. Well, the title is Workarounds to Internationalization, ICT's Reshaping Educational Delivery in Japan. So let me share the slides. Okay, so higher education in Japan is required to be more internationalized and better in instruction with active learning. On the other hand, we have appreciated the international recognition of high quality of school education. The missionary activities of Japanese-style education are recommended, like export of education or methods of education to foreign countries. The more courses taught in English and the more student mobility are counted as indicators for internationalization in higher education. Our satisfaction with the quality in schools did not count digitalization as a tool for bettering school education. COVID-19 pandemic restrained student mobility and face-to-face instruction. Even mailing printed study material was a popular reaction among elementary school teachers. Higher education leveraged ICTs with some success. For example, virtual student exchange and community engagement. It is not easy for school education sectors to facilitate online practices due to the lack of related experience and devices. Reactions to the pandemic vary in different educational sectors. Innovative use of ICTs may be a key not only to the internationalization of higher education, but also to connecting or reconnecting people in every educational sector. Okay, that's actually all that I prepared for today. Then,カットしてもらっていいですか?
Thank you very much indeed.
Okay.
Are you done? Are you finished now, Yasushi? Yeah.
Oh, it's okay. Well, so far in Japan, we have more cases, and the number is bigger and bigger. Firstly, well, like March and April, we're really concerned about our situation, but the number of cases is relatively small. But now, the more than double or triple cases that we had 6 months or 8 months ago. Then I don't know what would happen in Japan. Actually, March and April was the transitional period for school education. So teachers worry about in the future, but they didn't need to teach classes because the academic year is almost over. But on the other hand, for students, they lost many opportunities to say goodbye to their friends, and the many commencement or graduation ceremonies canceled. And even at the beginning of the academic year, which is at the beginning of April, and we needed to cancel administration ceremony as well. And for Japanese, those kind of ceremonies are quite important, but unfortunately, those generations lost more memorial opportunities. Then for educators, how we can put new experience to those students who lost their good memories. Well, then I would like to listen to what happened in other countries. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Yasushi. Thank you indeed. And I'm sure we're going to come back to these questions and issues in a moment. But before we do, it's my great pleasure to introduce as our next speaker, Professor Zeng Xiaodong from Beijing Normal University. Professor Zeng.
Hi, I'm here. Thank you very much for your for Professor introducing me. I'm very glad to participate in this event. This reminded me in 2008, I with another dean in Singapore, we signed this agreement. And yes, it's very happy, more than 10 years passed by, and we come together in this way to give us a collective voice on this pandemic. So the feeling, the perception is quite complicated. One side, I'm very happy. We work together to give the world our collective voice. Another side, we did together in this way. So it's a little bit sad, but at least we work together. So I would like to give my voice on this event. And today I will participate. The view come from Western part of the world. My perception, my presentation is student voice on online learning during lockdown. Okay. During May, we organized 5 panel meetings at that time because in the May, China education system was totally locked down, and nobody know when the school will reopen. So in May, we can say I can say it's a darkness for the education system in China. So nobody know what will happen and how the pandemic last, how long it will last. So at that time, we organized this 5 panel meeting. We want to know what's the education response in the pandemic. Because I work as an executive director for INEI. INEI is a UNESCO category 2nd institution, and his mission is rural education. And so we want to know education, rural school is an end of education system. What's their response in COVID-19 crisis? That's our primary purpose in why we organize this panel meeting. And I also would like to provide some background information. From central government to local education authority, there is a totally 4 levels, from central to provincial to city to county. So 4 levels in education. So I would like to do, a rural education, rural school, they located in the very far ending of the system. What's their response? Are they get enough support? So that's why I organized 5 panel. I really, finally, I find their voice, from the local officer, principal, parents, teacher, and student. Totally 5 panels. I find student voice, their voice on online learning quite different with others, different with their teacher, different with their principal, and different with their parents. And among them, they also give a different response. So I would like to share my findings in this panel meeting. So in the sample, some students come from 2 advanced county. One is in Qingdao, another one is in Jiangsu, Wuxi. And some students come from 2 medium developed county, Jiangxi and Heilongjiang, and the rest of students come from the 4 poor and remote counties. This is a sample distribution, and our findings, I find adult, their response is as you expected. They are complaining about their burden, extra burden. They don't like online learning, and they complain, the role shifting from teacher to parents, and parents complain the extra burden, and the teacher complains their social work they have to carry on, and but the student, their voice quite different. Are they hate online learning? Yes, most say yes, but not all. Not all students don't like hate online learning. Some students very enjoy the flexible learning pattern. And are they missing their friend? Yes, but some of them, even more of them, they are the first generation of website. So they are quite familiar with online gathering. So they are very happy. Are they missing? No, we gathering online every day. So they didn't complain as much as we expected. So are they, this rural school get the problem of access to Wi-Fi and device? Yes, but the real pattern is more complicated in real life. For example, beside Wi-Fi device, they also have the problem to access to quiet room for each child. When the family have more than 1 child, and they are in the same time have to take the online learning at the same time. So the family face the problem to provide quiet rooms for every children. This is an access problem. And you can find smartphone. Most students get access to online learning by smartphone, not by iPad or laptops, because they are the students in rural areas. So most students get access to online learning by smartphone, not iPad. And the students also complain. They reflect in their self-regulation. They feel sad about their performance. They have different pressure on the coming school opening. Some students show they're really concerned about the coming opening, but some, yes, they said they are concerned, but their reflection is not very strong. And lived or recorded broadcast they prefer. they prefer live broadcast. Even the recorded broadcast is given by some good teacher in good school, quite far from their school, but they prefer their own teacher give their lived broadcast. And the teacher as a tutor, in online teaching and learning, ICT provide alternative option for rural school in improving their education quality. And maybe they provide a solution for solving the typical resources allocation in rural area, because it's all the country in the world feels the pressure to assign some qualified teacher in rural and remote area. But ICT, if ICT can provide a very successful solution, this means, well, to some extent, we can solve this problem. However, in this pandemic, you can find pedagogical issue remains a technical barrier for future action. So ICT is not yet a solution for the resources allocation in rural area. Okay, conclusion. This picture is a migrant workers girl. His parents have to back to their workplace, back to the business, but her parents don't like to leave her home alone, so they bring her to their workplace and provide a very quite small and small and very crowded place for her to get access to online learning. But you can find even the government have taken some effort for equal opportunity, but during pandemic, this equal effort encounter huge gap among families. Another conclusion is student personality play a very important role during online learning. So self-regulation is works personality. ICT promoting education quality in rural areas sound good but unclear. This is my three conclusion. Follow up. INRULED, UNESCO, would like to take some follow-up action. We would like to jointly organize a conference with RITE, UNESCO. This is International Intelligence. So we would like to further explore this issue, and we would like welcome you to participate in this coming event again. Hope we can further discuss this issue. Okay, this is my funding and my invitation. Thank you very much for your listening.
Thank you very much, Professor Dung. Thank you indeed. So our last speaker now is Dr. Natasha Zabel from the University of Melbourne. Natasha.
I just wanted to introduce very briefly the context in Australia. We're a very multicultural and diverse society, and we have a population of around 25 million people. During the lockdown period, I did, just to give you a bit of an idea about how it was managed across Australia, I've created a timeline that I'll share now. Just if you bear with me. There we go. Okay, now this timeline was really quite interesting because what it shows is that the different states and territories across Australia had different policies in relation to COVID, depending on what was happening in the state. Now, we are a federation of 6 states and 2 territories. So we did have policies at the national level. However, the states ultimately decided how the school systems would be managed during this time. So as you'll see in Victoria, now Victoria probably had they did have the most significant and extreme lockdown periods, and that was a direct result of the impact of COVID here in Victoria. So we had a lockdown period of 11 weeks. Things went back to, we had an interim period, but then as cases started to escalate again, we went into a second lockdown period. So 25 weeks altogether, with the number of cases peaking in August. So we've had well over a month of 0 cases in Victoria, and things are starting to open up again. But you'll notice in the other states and territories that they had a much shorter period of lockdown and remote learning. And we had, in some states, we had optional remote learning. So schools remained open in every state for essential workers, but in some states there was an optional option. So if parents wanted to keep their children at home because they had various concerns or the children were vulnerable for some reason, the teachers then needed to continue teaching their class, but also ensure that there was provision for students learning from their home environment. So even though these aren't shaded in very much, the teachers in those situations were still trying to manage dual modes of delivery. We actually had the opportunity to release a research project, or to conduct a research project at the height of all of the closures across the states. I won't report on those, but I will comment that Professor Zhang's results are very similar. There are some common themes across the countries internationally. Now, I did want to just quickly raise some of the issues that, or some of the processes that we went through. So similar to other countries, the initial policies in Australia were health directives, which were aimed at saving lives. So the education system was forced to move to remote learning modes rapidly. There was no time for planning. It just happened instantly. The initial response, the teaching practices, or the strategies employed weren't policy driven at all. It was really driven by the profession from the ground up. Teachers and schools at the local level had to develop and continually refine policies on the run really quickly, from teaching and learning expectations and schedules to managing online platforms, use of cameras and so on, because we were suddenly now working in people's personal spaces. Over time, the departments of education in the various jurisdictions did develop operation guidelines and protocols for schools that covered everything from home provision to personal hygiene. But, this really was a period of rapid change and there wasn't time for, thorough policy development. Everyone just had to manage and do the best they could. Now, some students thrived and some had significant difficulties. And I think this throws up a series of dilemmas about the use of technology for remote learning. It was a stopgap measure. Students' learning was impeded when there wasn't adequate access to technology. And this was not an issue caused by the pandemic, but these types of issues really expose persistent access issues, and they expose inequities in the system. And this was an issue not just for students living in regional and rural areas, but also students living in metropolitan areas where we had students using their mobile phone to access learning. Or in rural areas, the use of satellite internet, which is so expensive, it was prohibitive for some families. So again, the government then came in and provided additional devices for students and supported with funding for Wi-Fi. But it was a challenging time for those students, and it meant that some students really did not have access for a period of time. Despite the challenges experienced by teachers, parents and students during this time, I think there are also opportunities that emerged that we can now learn from. The first one is that remote learning reaffirmed those established elements of classroom practice that are essential for effective learning. And one example is the social nature of learning and classroom interactions. These types of interactions were instantly muted in the remote learning environment, especially if the students had their cameras off. So the teachers had no way of knowing how students were responding to learning in the moment, like they do in a classroom. Sometimes teachers know just when a student walks in through the door how they're feeling that morning. So those verbal cues and those physical cues in our classroom environments were suddenly more difficult because the technology was a barrier. However, there are also opportunities in that remote learning provided affordances that we've never trialled before at scales. And what has been learned from that experience can now be adapted and adopted by schools. The questioning, the immediate feedback, the chat functions were very useful. Individual conferencing time via Zoom was absolutely important. So some of those practices can certainly be now adapted for classroom practice. And the final factor I'd like to mention is a critical role during this time that teachers play more broadly in society, and also the status of profession. I think the spotlight was really turned on the teaching profession, and I think there were some really extraordinary insights that were provided into teaching and learning in a way we haven't experienced before. And these stories were really taken up with enthusiasm by the media. Parental involvement also increased dramatically during this time. I think reaffirming and acknowledging that education really is a partnership between schools and families. And where that relationship broke down, it was very challenging for students to remain engaged. The debate on education has really gained momentum this year during 2020, and important questions related to the purpose of education, student engagement, the structure of the education system, and post-formal schooling pathways have been raised. Initial teacher education providers, NGOs, stakeholders and media are all contributing to this debate at the moment. And I think this shows just how invested we are as a society in the future of education. And I think it provides a really good launching pad now to consider perhaps some reform and some new ideas, some fresh ideas, creative ideas for education. Thank you, John.
Thanks very much, Natasha, for a very insightful overview of what has been happening in Australia. And thank you to all my speakers for their inputs on what has been a most trying and indeed traumatic time for all of us around the world in terms of dealing with education in this very unusual time. And I can see how there are synergies between our experiences globally, and also how there are different approaches to the way in which we manage education in our different contexts. And part of that has been just how agile our governments have managed to be in terms of responding to the effect of the pandemic and its sudden onset. And then indeed, as Natasha's just mentioned, indeed everybody has mentioned how the teaching profession has had to then step into that breach and take on a whole series of roles, which I think it was Dennis who said about the way in which pastoral care has changed, and we are taking on a multiplicity of roles as teachers and educators. And so I think to start off, I have a number of questions in the chat line. And one of the things that I think everybody touched on really was just the health and well-being of our pupils, of our student population. And as an aspect of that is, how are our governments responding to the problem of learning loss and catch-up in terms of what's happened in our schools, and supporting our students. Would anybody like to take that? Perhaps Dennis, would you like to kick us off?
Let me attend to that question about learning loss from school closure and catching up. Definitely, that was a key concern in Singapore, where the Ministry of Education, recognizing that when we had a lockdown, there is a potential loss in terms of time spent learning, which has strong indicators for opportunities to learn and for various kinds of learning outcomes. And I think they were very quick to make sure that even students, while students and children are at home, there must be some form of learning going on. We can call it remote learning, home-based learning, online learning, but basically just ensuring that kids are still trying to do some kind of learning at home. And I think that's what's been happening in Singapore's case. And I think they have been fairly successful in doing that. There were, as usual, a ton of hiccups when it began. Teachers didn't know how to help students with setting up online learning platforms, Zoom, Google Meet, and trying to use those. But I think what happened was that there was a whole community that was mobilized. The ministry, teachers, school communities, NIE researchers who came together, who really helped to get things moving along, which is why I think the importance of ensuring that there is as little learning loss as possible is a key priority in our countries. Now, in other countries where this is going to become a very big challenge, especially in rural areas where internet connectivity is a problem, then there has to be other alternatives. Rather than using technology-enabled forms of learning, there must be other kinds of learning that is possible, and that might decelerate the kinds of learning opportunities, but at least it's still moving along. I think that's kind of the key problem. Yeah.
Thank you.
Hi, John. Could I add some
Sure.
comments on this issue?
Please.
I said, as I said, yes, maybe most students have a learning loss, but somebody lost more. So during this semi-experiment event, I can say it proved that schooling, even we criticize our schooling system, but schooling is a mechanism to reducing the social gap. So during the lockdown, you know, the parents' difference and student difference play more role in the online learning. But if we take this closed down as a semi-experiment, you can say schooling is still a mechanism to reducing the social gap. That's my comments. Thank you, John.
Thank you very much, Professor Zhang. I'm conscious that I've got a lot of questions here, and we've got a limited amount of time. So if it's all right, I'm going to shift the emphasis now from the pupils to the teachers. And I'd like to try and combine two questions which I've got in the chat here. One asks, could the panel say more about the consequences of the COVID-19 pandemic for teachers? Dennis has talked about the breadth of their role, and indeed so has Natasha. And as part of that, in terms of the role of teachers, of course, the role of the teachers is to teach, but in online learning, does the panel think that that online teaching has strengthened the technical models of education, so that there's more emphasis on right and wrong answers in the actual mode of learning, the mode of practice? Or do you feel that there is now more possibility to support student capacity to engage with uncertainty and knowledge diversity, which effectively explore how they are experiencing their lives now? If I've articulated that sufficiently well, perhaps I could ask Natasha, would you like to talk about the teacher experience?
Sure. Now, it's a really good question, actually. And I think while teachers have done an admirable job this year, they've been incredibly creative and resilient. I think we need to also be mindful of how far the profession can be pushed now, looking forward. I think we need to tread cautiously. How much are we expecting from them moving forward? I worked with some teachers last week and they were enthusiastic. They were full of hope and inspiration for next year. But I'm also aware that there's a sense of fatigue that's starting to set in. Look, it's really interesting when you talk about the technical aspects. There's some research coming out now to show that student mathematical proficiency has actually increased during this time, but other skills such as writing have not shown as much progress as you would expect in a classroom. So yes, look, teachers were really creative. They were creating videos so students could review those videos during remote learning time. I think what it did do for a lot of teachers is to really sharpen their focus on curriculum and really think about what's important, because you can't cover as much during remote learning. And in fact, even if they were, they spent some time online face-to-face during the day, a lot of schools reduced the amount of screen time. So the students might have only met, particularly in primary school, for an hour or two in the morning, and then were given tasks, reading tasks, maths tasks to work through at home. I just did want to mention something too, though. One of the concerns from our teachers were for those students that were already disengaged with the education system, and the remote learning period then further disengaged them. So it was very difficult in some cases for teachers to make contact with those students. And I'm sure that in some cases they may never have returned to school. So I think in terms of our more vulnerable students, teachers had a very difficult time. In our research, we found that 75% of teachers said that they were really concerned about student wellbeing during this time. So there's some of the issues that have been raised. And I think looking forward, we need to both look after the teaching profession, think about what's realistic in terms of moving forward, but also just highlight perhaps those opportunities that we found during this remote period and learn from them.
Thanks very much, Natasha. That's really, I think really sums up indeed what we're all thinking in terms of what the panel has been saying. I'd like to have one more question before we close. So thank you for that contribution, Natasha. I'm now going to put this one actually to Yasushi and Kevin, because I think this speaks to the context in which you framed your particular talks and contributions in terms of higher education and what higher education is doing. So I have a question here that is, do you think your Faculty of Education will change its research agenda very much following COVID-19? Kevin or Yasushi? Kevin?
Well, yes, I certainly do. I think that there's no way that any sort of educational agency is not going to respond and change its agenda coming out of COVID-19. But I think one of the areas that we have to look at, and this is in response to all the questions, is the more positive sort of outcome of this transformation. And so we think of it like a learning loss or a technical fix, or think of it in a negative sense. But we forget that these students are digital natives, a lot of these young people. This isn't just a technical aspect of their life. This is embedded in every aspect of what they do. So I think we can see a learning surplus that comes out of the experience of students learning online, and we start to look at it in a more positive sense. So I'll just give one from higher education, from my own particular context. I work in an L2 context for my students. I teach in English, but my students are not native English speakers, so to speak. And going online, the unexpected positive outcome of this was that the students participate more in class. They can translate content online using Google Translate. And this offers them the potential to actually be more active in class. They're much more familiar, I think, with the technology than we are. And so one of the areas that's going to come out from the educational technology research is an area looking at the positives of what we're doing, and the reality that this isn't going away post-COVID. Hybrid teaching is going to continue probably from here on out.
Thank you, Kevin. Yasushi, what do you think?
Well, let me introduce what we did during lockdown. So April and May, while schools are closed, and we faculty members of or School of Education, we needed provided online teaching classroom for college students, but also we provided webinars to school teachers. At the time, we didn't know the name of webinar. we called it online seminars. And every 2 weeks, we were provided webinars. And we had about 100 participants from all over Japan. And so we didn't know how to organize online teaching. But at the time, I didn't know the name of Microsoft Teams. Now I'm very good at using Teams. But at the beginning of academic year, which is April, no one knows how to create online classes. And what I want to say is we didn't change something that we think very important. But the framework is, we needed to change the framework, but the inside contents, we never changed. Then I think the connectedness or colleagueness or collegiality is very important for teachers, not only school teachers, but the connection with university researchers and school teachers. Well, we try to keep the connection, even though we have no physical or attachment, but the only digitalization is the way how we can connect with other people. Well, still we are keeping the webinars, and now we have too much webinars. Well, 2 webinars every day, for example. Well, but anyway, thank you.
Thank you very much, Yasushi, and I certainly empathize with your experience there. I do feel that my day in my university is in a way much fuller than it was before, because there are no gaps between the different things that I do in my day, because everything is virtual, or nearly everything is virtual. Well, look, unfortunately, we have actually reached the end of our time, but it has been my great pleasure and honor to have such a distinguished panel to discuss this very important issue. And so I thank you very much for participating in this event. And I am indeed looking forward to meeting you all again following the pandemic face to face, and that will be a great thing. I'd also like to thank everybody who has attended online. It's been wonderful to have you here, if not to be able to see you, but wherever you are and whatever you're doing, have a wonderful day today, look after yourselves, and we will get together and we will come through this together as well. Thank you very much, and goodbye.